Trading blocs are a grouping of countries which promotes trade activities and has advantages like paying lower prices for goods and services. Now, there are many trading blocs around the world, but what if the ones that excluded the U.S. would trade amongst each other? What impact would that have on the world economy? Hi, I'm Kavit Harvai. World trade without the U.S., the subject of today's edition of Economic Divide. First, a look at different forms of trade blocs. There are 5 in total, like preferential trading area, free trade area, and customs union. Others of equal importance are the common market and the economic union, all of which we will discuss in this program. Also, we're going to take a look at regional blocs within a specific geographical boundary, but without the U.S. To what extent does trade occur between these countries with the goal of securing regional economic growth? Blocs like ASEAN, RCEP, BRICS, and SCO. And finally, countries club of sanctions. U.S. sanctioned countries, can they prosper without the U.S. trade policies, and taking steps like joint monetary institutions and trading without the dollar as the main currency? U.S. policy of America First, which was heavily promoted by the former U.S. President Donald Trump, has now come back to haunt the U.S.
Obviously, we're not going to be talking too much about it.
Donald Trump did come through on his promised threats to erect protectionist walls around the U.S. economy. But what does this phrase mean?
On this Buy America issue, it's a mixed bag. The bad news are that protectionist pressures are there.
At the end of World War II, U.S. leaders at the time saw the U.S. as leading a world order when it came to democracy, open trade, and growing prosperity. Programs were made based on this vision, like the Marshall Plan. Then institutions like the UN, the World Bank, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade were formed. The GATT later became the World Trade Organization, or WTO, in the year 1995. Fast forward to today. Now, the U.S. is increasingly finding itself isolated on the world economic stage. Many trade blocs don't have the U.S. as a member. Thanks to the former U.S. President Donald Trump and his America First policy, the U.S. has become more isolated. That isolation came in the form of pulling out of trade blocs, like the Trans-Pacific Partnership or the TPP. Citing confronting unfair trade practices by China, the U.S. failed to secure new opportunities for U.S. exporters in Asia. Then the RCEP was introduced, the world's largest free trade bloc comprised of 15 Asia-Pacific economies minus the U.S. The span 30% of the global economy and 30% of the global population.
We are absolutely right that this is one of the world's largest free trade agreements, if not the largest. It's going to cover 15 countries with about 30% of the world's population and 30% of the world's economy. That includes China, Japan, South Korea, the 10 Asian countries, Australia and New Zealand. So it's going to make much of Asia Pacific into a free trade zone.
The whole notion of forming a trade bloc is to ease trade, pure and simple. Sounds simple enough, but there are different types of trade blocs, 5 of them to be exact. Now, in simple terms, first, preferential trading. It's the simplest form of the trade bloc. Then we go to free trade area. This involves removing restrictions on trading between members. Customs union, a more advanced stage. Its main objective to overcome the trade deflection. Then a common market, combination of customs union, plus the removal of barriers. Economic union. This combines all aspects of the common market and also coordinates economic policy. One example, the Eurozone, which adopted the currency, the euro. Okay, let's bring in our guest for hopefully a better explanation of these different trade blocs. Ian Williams is an economic expert at Foreign Policy in Focus. It's a think tank without walls, as it says, seeking to make the United States a more responsible global partner. It is a project of the Institute for Policy Studies. Ian, welcome. I just went over 5 trade blocs which are out there, but if you can, please define the whole notion behind a trade bloc, the advantages, disadvantages, and how countries pick and choose who wants to actually join the bloc.
Well, under classical economic theory, as invented by the British before they were in and out of the European community, free trade was the ideal. Countries should be able to trade with each other. So the question of a trading bloc didn't really appear. But trading blocs were anomalies. People set them up. Like there was a British Empire trading bloc, and the Americans had a zone in Latin America where they traded freely. What this usually meant was a strong party said, I want to sell you things and I will buy your stuff if you allow me to sell freely in your territory. So, it's not necessarily a bad thing. But then we got into the whole issue of protectionism, which you would never guess from listening to them now, but it was the Americans who invented protectionism as we know it. And they did it for the same reasons as subsequent countries. They wanted to protect their industries against developing industries from elsewhere. So American industry was developed behind high tariff walls that kept out foreign competition. Then when they got a secure position, like the British, they said, we want free trade. And they started shouting at people like the Chinese and the Japanese who were trying to develop their own industries.
Time now for our Info News section. There were lots of news stories that we wanted to cover in this section of the program, but unfortunately we didn't have the time. But here goes. Without a doubt, the first story takes the prize, and it has to deal with tax evasion. Now, tax evasion remains a problem in the world. One report, including over 300 politicians, high-level public officials, and the span 90 countries and territories, including 35 country leaders, well, they have gone away with not paying taxes. And here's an important point that goes unnoticed in a sense, or underreported, and that the tax money could go to building their nations. And of course, they're hiding their taxes in offshore accounts, and that doesn't go towards nation building. Next up, IMF forecast, world forecast trimmed. The reason inflation. I'm telling you, inflation is going to be the biggest story for this year. You're going to see prices skyrocketing. This is why the GDP forecast has been trimmed. It cited vaccine divide inflation as the cause for the projection cut. But more alarming in the report was that though advanced economies will return to pre-pandemic levels, most emerging and developing countries will need many more years to recover. Next up, trade bloc. Well, it's a good topic, our topic of the program. U.S. and Europe need are after a new trade cooperation. It seems like that's in the works. However, there's stumbling blocks. One of them is this conflict that is a big one where the EU is asking the U.S. for a 25% steel tax rollback. If you remember, the previous U.S. President Trump is the one who actually executed that, and now the U.S. wants that rollback. Or the EU that is, wants that rollback. All right, and here, Kellogg's, the makers of cereal, I'm sure you're familiar with them. The workers in the U.S. nationwide have gone on a strike, and what they're striking for are that their benefits are being slashed or downgraded. Things such as insurance, for example, and other benefits as a whole. And this is while Kellogg's is obviously recording great profits at its corporate headquarters. Time now for our in-depth section. In order to get a real sense of where the U.S. stands when it comes to GDP growth, for example, and the world economies vis-a-vis the trade blocs, we have to take a look at the indicators to look at the real output or performance of the U.S. So let's start with the U.S. GDP. Now, as you can see in this graph, as you can see in the title, it has fallen 3.5%, the biggest drop since 1946 for the year 2020. Now, this goes back to the year 1950, and you can see the different indicators here in the graph in terms of the growth or negative growth of the U.S., but this is obviously what we're zooming in at, negative 3.5% for the year 2020, and that is when the pandemic hit. So you can see the contraction there again. That's the biggest drop since the year 1946. So obviously, that's not good news for the U.S. However, we're in the year 2021. What does it look like for this year? Here are some of the indicators for Q1 2021, the quarter that we're in. And you can see the different categories, gross domestic product, personal consumption here. You have the gross private domestic investment that's gone down 3.4%. That's not good news. But if you want to take a look at this profile, we're going to zoom in on this category right over here. This is the net exports of goods and services. And take a look at this figure, negative $875 billion. I mean, that's really bad. Because obviously, when you take a look at exports of goods and services, you're looking at what's not being sold and what's not going overseas to different prospective buyers. And here is where you can see the U.S. getting hurt by not being part of that major trade bloc. Now, let's take a look at the projections of other countries in overall, and we've picked some at random here that are of note and importance. For example, China. These are the main countries, again, projections that are set out. And you can see China's ranking in at 18.3%, South Korea 1.8%, France 1.5%, and here the U.S. 0.4%. So that's not a whole lot of growth there. And more interesting is when you take a look at Europe. Now, minus Japan, Germany, Italy, and the UK having a negative GDP, I guess, contraction, if you want to call it that. And of course, the UK coming in at negative 6.1%. That's obviously not good news for the UK. You can see Brexit being one of the problems, and of course, energy problems that that country is also experiencing. Now, finally, we take a look at this breakdown, which is for the Asia region, and look at that. I mean, you could take a look at the growths that are happening in ascending order: South Korea, Indonesia, Australia, Philippines, all of them in the positive. China 8.5%, India at 10.2%. And guess what? These are all the countries that the U.S., in a sense, is being left out from because it did not want to be part of a trade bloc. And in particular, the trade bloc that I'd like to talk about here is the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership.
With a flurry of signatures, the world's biggest trade bloc came into existence on Sunday. 15 Asia-Pacific economies forming the China-backed Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership at a virtual summit. And one notable absence, the United States. With the US under President Donald Trump having left the Barack Obama-led Trans-Pacific Partnership, the world's biggest economy is now on the outside of two trade groups spanning the world's fastest growing region.
Yes, and the RCEP was signed actually in the year 2020, so the U.S. is left out of that. So let's try to get an idea now about some of the countries that were part of this RCEP, the regional trade bloc that we mentioned. This is the span, 15 countries, population-wise 2.2 billion, combined GDP, $26.2 trillion, and then the share of the global trade, 28%. Putting that into context, you have some of the other blocs here. For example, the SCO, Iran just became a member of, $7 trillion combined trade volume. The BRICS countries, $20 trillion. This is the ASEAN countries, $3 trillion. The EU, $15 trillion. And then you have Mercosur, $3 trillion. Again, these are blocs that the U.S. is not part of that. In order to get an idea about what was just discussed, let me bring in a guest to break this down. You have Robert Brusca, who's a chief economist of Fact and Opinion Economics. It's a consulting firm that he founded in Manhattan. He has been an economist on Wall Street for over 25 years, and he has visited central banking and large institutional clients in over 30 countries in his career as an economist. Okay, Robert, welcome. Let's take a look at what has happened here. You have major blocs that increasingly don't have the U.S. as part of that grouping, whether it's trade blocs or regional blocs. Has this created a situation where the U.S. is being left behind on world trade? In other words, will the trade volume of these countries actually outpace the U.S. in trade volume?
Well, with the U.S. being outside of a lot of trade blocs, there's a question as to whether or not that's significant or not. For one thing, the U.S. is a huge demand market, and a lot of firms, a lot of countries want to export goods into the U.S. So the U.S., whether it's in a trade bloc or not, continues to exert a lot of influence over trade because countries need access to the U.S. domestic market. And this is one of the big problems the U.S. has when it considers a trade bloc, is the U.S. often doesn't have that much export penetration, but all these countries want to gain access to the U.S. market. And so the U.S. wants to be careful when it joins a bloc that it isn't giving up access to its market in return for getting very little in terms of access for its exports, and particularly for services where the U.S. tends to have more of an advantage and where countries tend to be more restrictive. So it doesn't do the U.S. much good to be in a trade bloc that is going to block our services but want to penetrate our market with their goods exports. So I think because the U.S. is still a large market that countries want to sell into, the U.S. continues to have a lot of leverage, even when it trades with various trade blocs, because the trade bloc would want to maintain access to the U.S. market because it's such a big, rich market.
Increasingly, there are a number of countries that are targets of U.S. sanctions. Iran, one of them, along with China and Russia, just to name a few here. Well, the U.S. dollar has caused damages, being used as the currency for international transactions, but that is increasingly becoming a target for elimination. One of these methods is to conclude bilateral or multilateral monetary treaties using the local currencies and eliminating the dollar as a consequence. So far, you have roughly about 50 countries that have signed bilateral currency treaties among themselves, eliminating the U.S. dollar from their exchanges. Additionally, creating and replacing the SWIFT financial system with an alternative one can help with stopping the U.S. sanctions effect. Russia actually has launched a messaging system. It's called SPFS, and China is looking at switching from SWIFT to cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS, due to these U.S. sanctions. Okay, Ian Williams and Robert Brusca rejoin us here. I first going to go to you, Ian. We are back to the dollar issue. How pivotal a role does this play when it comes to trade? Can countries or countries within a trading bloc trade amongst others as to stop the U.S. hegemony when it comes to world trade and economy vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar?
Then the other trading blocs are not going to work. In Latin America, they have trading blocs. They have Mercosur. They have agreements between Brazil and Argentina. They trade in dollars.
All right, Ian was to the point. Robert, let me come to you. There's an exception here, however. We have countries that do trade without the dollar, who are under sanctions, like Russia, China, Iran, Venezuela. These are countries that conduct trade, like Iran, for example, who delivered to Lebanon and Venezuela with oil and gas. So there are exceptions to the rule, aren't there?
Of course, these are countries that the United States has a lot of political differences with, and has for quite some time. And there's a recent schism with Venezuela. Venezuela used to be a country that the U.S. did a lot of trade with, and of course, Venezuela has oil, but it has this heavy, what they call heavy sour oil, the Orinoco grade, that has been a little bit less advantage. And of course, the other problem with Venezuela is it's allowed its oil facilities to deteriorate quite substantially. And so when you look at these countries, that are not countries that have an awful lot to offer the U.S. in terms of trade. The U.S. has had this lack of trade with Cuba for quite a long time for political reasons. And so I don't think you have a list of countries there that put the United States at any kind of an economic disadvantage. In fact, these are countries that the U.S. has long-standing political difficulties with, and they need to have more of a political agreement before they're going to even be able to think of having a closer economic agreement.
Why do trade agreements collapse? In theory, the signing of a deal which can boost an economy should be a win-win situation for all parties concerned. Yet, when we take a look back at trade agreements of the past, and even ones that are still in play, one of the major challenges in maintaining an agreement are the political differences between nations. Take, for example, the case of the EU. The varying cultures and political views in Europe is as wide as a spectrum can allow. And hence, this is why the UK, for example, broke away from the EU. Yet, as we all know and have seen, the devastating economic cost to Britain appears to be far greater than the benefits of leaving the bloc over political differences. The same can be said of the NAFTA agreement, which saw Trump pull out, citing a bad deal. This is another example of how differences in political thought have changed the shape of the trade deals that were actually quite successfully in place. But the US, by pulling out of trade deals, has seen itself be isolated on the world stage. The RCEP is one example, again an agreement that has been criticized that it will more likely benefit China more than other signatory members. However, with China being the economic powerhouse behind the agreement, it seems that China in particular has a lot to gain by having 14 other free trade partners at its disposal in the RCEP. The economic expansion sought by China and demonstrated through the likes of the One Belt, One Road initiative are clear examples of how China is using trade to expand its footprint around the world. And as we deal with trade wars, COVID-19, and economic uncertainty, the RCEP, again, an example of China's multilateral adaptability to its economic roadmap.
Well, I think speaking of China, we need to think about, we need to put this against the general background of Chinese economic strategy. China has been promoting very hard its very ambitious One Belt and One Road project across the globe. And it comes at a very interesting time. We are now in the middle of a global pandemic. We are also seeing an escalating tension in China and the US and also some regional countries. So I think this is something that will be supplementing China's One Belt, One Road project.
The notion of multilateralism is a concept that should be embraced. Yet the world has started to see super trade deals emerging without the US. For example, the 25-year Iran-China Cooperation Agreement will see $400 billion or more in trade between the two countries. Meanwhile, Iran has also joined the SCO, the Shanghai Cooperation Council.
Мы всегда выступали за полноформатное участие Ирана в работе нашей организации, исходя из того, что эта страна играет важную роль в евразийском регионе и уже давно плодотворно сотрудничает с ШОС. Вступление Ирана, безусловно, будет способствовать дальнейшему повышению международного авторитета организации.
With addition of new member countries, I think it will give countries in this region opportunity to bring together their efforts in order to more integrate their supply chain positions in the region, so that countries will be more integrated from the point of view of a regional value chain. I think this will make a very positive impact on countries in this region compared to the existing ones.
My final thoughts: world trade is changing. Globalism is the preferred way, the old system that ruled the world finance, with protectionism abolished for the most part. Well, COVID-19 has changed regional dynamics, but not regional trade. And when it comes to the U.S., it is becoming evident that it will remain on the back foot, not only because of the pandemic, the economic contraction that it experienced, but also due to its trade war with China. There's also an increasing number of countries who want and don't mind doing trade without the U.S., especially ones that are under U.S. sanctions, who also would prefer not to trade in dollars as to not be restricted to U.S. hegemony. So far, roughly about 50 countries have signed bilateral currency treaties among themselves, eliminating the U.S. dollar from their exchanges. That does it for this edition of the program. It was great having you on board. Hope to see you again next week. Any questions or comments, by the way, please do send them. From me, Kaveh Tarvai, and the entire team, is goodbye until next week.